Aloha. This is ThinkTech Hawaii. Welcome to my show. This is the state of Hawaii. I'm your host, Stephanie Dalton. Today's show is about Hawaii education and President Biden's rescue funding for it. The news is Hawaii State Agency, the Department of Education, will soon receive generous funding through the President's American Rescue Act, or ARP. It was enacted on March the 11th, and it will help states safely reopen schools, maintain safe operation of those schools, and of course, importantly, address the impact on students from the COVID-19 pandemic. So it looks like we are going to have enough resources for true operations and maybe renewal in them as well. The ARP allocation is what we're going to talk about today, and that has to do with the funding to all the states and especially to Hawaii. And there's the list of all the states and their allocations. Hawaii's allocation from the federal government, from the American Rescue Act, is $412 million, 412,328,764. Wait, excuse me, I'm not reading this number right. Let me put it briefly. It's $412 million plus a few more. And comparatively, Texas will receive over 12 billion. California is the largest recipient, and they will receive over 15 billion for their schools. And Maine is the state that receives about the same as Hawaii. 8 states have lower allocations than Hawaii, and those are Alaska, Washington, D.C., Montana, New Hampshire, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming. But the funding also provides money in addition to this for special education. So there's $3 billion to support special education operations and safety and maintenance. And also in that funding is it accommodates the homeless children and youth as well. There are also additional funds for the tribal educational agencies, Alaska Natives, and importantly, again, for Hawaii in this funding, the Native Hawaiian students also receive support. Now, the really good news is that the U.S. Department of Education will begin making funds available to states this month. So that will be funds coming very soon. The funding, this means that we're in position to talk about it and understand it and be able to make some recommendations to those who in our state of Hawaii are going to be thinking about what is going to happen with this funding. When altogether, this funding totals $122 billion that has gone to the states and school districts in the US. And this is what is going to bring us back, hopefully, from the devastation to our students' learning and attainment as soon as possible. And now I understand how our department in Hawaii of Education has already made plans to have summer school for students and have no charge. So there'll be services for free. And because they will be in position now for sure to be able to carry on that promise of support for people that really, really need it. So today in our show, the conversation is with guests who are education experts and who have worked for many years to promote the success of students in public schools across the nation and here in Hawaii. They have studied and worked in numerous initiatives and programs to strengthen public school education for all students, and particularly for at-risk English language learners, and certainly diverse students everywhere, as well as in Hawaii. Please welcome Associate Professor Hector Rivera from Texas A&M at College Station in Texas, and teacher, coach, and author Sue Entz. Both of them are researchers and published authors. And Sue's book was a nice, has been well used and brought teachers into using technology quite a while ago. And the technology was something as common as cameras, and thinking about how to make that happen in the classroom to engage students with content concepts in ways that are meaningful for them through this joint activity. Hector works with teachers of Native American students in literacy and mathematics and with Spanish-speaking families and communities and students on how to succeed in public schools in several states. The name of Sue's book I didn't mention. The name of the book is Picture This, and it's by Sue Entz, and I'm sure she can. You can find it if you can't. Write to ThinkTechHawaii.com, and we'll help you get it. So welcome, Hector.
Thank you.
And Sue, welcome.
Yes,
Thank you for participating on ThinkTech Hawaii today. Okay, I think that with the funding total being so large, that it will be certainly a challenge. I'm sure that this is good news, but it also has its challenges. And I think that the large what this might mean to Hawaii is something you can help talk about from the big picture and even in specific instances for those who may be making the decisions about the funds, but may not have as broad a view as you all do. So I think that you are in good position to comment and make recommendations, which we can kind of tally at the end of the program. But how are the policymakers or those that are tasked with deciding how this is all going to work in alignment with what the U.S. Department of Education will require? How will they do that? So I think that this isn't the only set of recommendations that will go forward to these people who will be making such huge decisions, because many people will have input. But in general, how do you see such research sources as this amount for our students being beneficial for the schools, the public schools of Hawaii? So maybe you could comment. Sue, you're a long experienced here in the state. How does it look to you? How do you see this as being a win? I mean, how can it not be a win with this much to use?
well, it's such an enormous opportunity. The concern would be making sure as much of it gets down to the classroom level as possible, so that teachers who have direct contact with students have the benefit of these resources. We have, as you know, we have a statewide school system that's very large and sometimes a little cumbersome. So, especially since the money's coming quickly and it's going to be dispersed quickly, having a system for getting it down to a place where it will have the most impact on students would be, beneficial.
And I think as you look at the information, either in the news media or in the actual documents that are on the website of the U.S. Department of Education, you can go up there and take a closer look at all of it. But the funding is definitely directed to not only the state education agency, which is the State Department of Education, we call it here, but also to the local education agencies, which in non-government lingo is the public schools.
Mhm.
So that there is a voice that the federal side is trying to put in place here. So Stu, do you know anything about how that might work? Has that worked well in the past?
I think there's been mixed results in the past. So hopefully learning from the distribution problems that they had occasionally in the past, I'm hopeful that it will get out as quickly as possible. I'm especially concerned about new teachers who are going to be having unusual challenges this year because they're going to have students who are coming in without the support that they've had in the past because of COVID. They maybe not quite as prepared as they have been in the past. So how do we support those very new teachers who have some real challenges ahead?
Very good point. Yeah. Well, Hector, you've worked broadly in the country. So what do you think these resources are gonna, what impact are they gonna have? Are they gonna be beneficial? And for whom?
And first of all, yes, I agree with Sue that one of the challenges is going to be how resources are going to be distributed. And also, I think that part of the distribution process, one of the things that states need to think about is whether they are going to have the type of professional development that will allow their leadership to understand what these resources are for and how to best utilize them. One example is that in many cases, and this is not necessarily for this situation, but in many cases, funding from a state or from the federal government, because educators, or in this case, school principals or administrators at a higher level, don't know how to manage them, they end up using them for purposes that aren't supposed to be used for. And so that's a challenge, right? Even though they may say, we're using it for education, it may not be the actual purpose for which it was given. And so, for example, in the case of English language learners, we know that it is important that the resources go to meet the needs of those students. Otherwise, then we are faced with the same situation where students will be left behind.
Yes, and that is a dire need at this point to make sure that doesn't happen because they've already been left behind. I mean, they're already a year behind, and
Mhm.
hopefully most will be able to take advantage of the summer programs that will be on offer. Let's see if that enrollment kicks up to the point where there's not even enough room for them, but people may or may not be able to take advantage of that, and hopefully they do. Such a good point. Yeah. I think too that we've got the high need students here as well, and of course the it's our state in Hawaii is highly diverse, and there are other activities and cultural issues that are important to observe, and hopefully will be open to getting the students back into the classroom as soon as possible. Well, now I think that it's unlikely now that in the post-pandemic period, hopefully, that many Hawaii citizens, it's really unlikely that they are unfamiliar with the role of schooling and teaching in children's lives. Well, certainly the role of schooling in home lives with the what we know now as the babysitting feature that everybody misses tremendously, but also about the challenge of teaching children because so many people now have been engaged in that just in order to keep the kids involved with schooling. So how do you think that the parents and community members, having been through all of this experience of the last year, at least the last year, what do you think their notions of this funding are? I think Hector, you work with community organization a lot. What would the expectations be of the parents and the community for funding like this?
I think that the first thing is that for many communities and families is that realization of how little they have to support their kids. And I think it's really important that any state, whether it is Hawaii or Texas or any other place, they take a closer look at that. That there is a disproportion, in the way resources are distributed, and even we saw that clearly from the beginning of the pandemic, where kids didn't have computers, some of them didn't have access to internet, and some of them didn't have the basic resources that are necessary. And so I think that some parents coming from low socioeconomic status are facing those challenges and they still don't know what to do. So I think that definitely one key component is to be the engagement of the community and the families in the process on how these resources can be allocated. If we truly want to impact education and we truly want to impact the lives of these children, then we have to engage the community. It's part of the process because some of the mandates under that ARP is that there has to be a thought about how schools will be open safely and how that will be maintained. So if that's the case, then we cannot do it by ourselves. We have to engage the whole community, and we have to engage other people in the process.
Sue, how do you think that might work here in Hawaii?
Well, I agree completely with Hector. And I think it's not only the low socioeconomic students who had problems with distance learning, but I live on the Big Island. We're largely a rural place.
Mhm.
The difference between rural and urban is as much a problem as the low socioeconomic folks. Um, for many of our students, just the internet access, sometimes me getting on the computer to have this conversation with you is a little spotty where I live. Um, so I think that the pandemic really underscored for parents and for community leaders some of the underlying problems that we've always known were there, but we're able to do workarounds when kids were in class. When they had to stay home, there weren't very many workarounds that were successful.
Yeah. I think too, even on Oahu, which is considered fairly urban, though there are some rural areas, there the broadband access is not even at all. So
Mhm.
yeah, you're making some really important points. Also, how it is that there is sufficient equipment to for large families to be able to have all their youngsters engaged, at the same time rather than having to take turns and staying up the night.
I
But
just,
yeah,
if I can do just one more thing on that. Um, I think parents got a firsthand view of what the content was being delivered, um, but also a better understanding of their own children's learning styles. Some kids learn really well through technology. Some kids really don't, and having a greater appreciation of how individual education really needs to be, and maybe hopefully how parents can advocate for the kids a little better.
yeah, and in that advocacy is also a challenge to teachers that they themselves are good, very good, and excellent, and not so good on technology, and have to learn how to do that too. So I think it's another domain of expertise that has to be developed. And fortunately, we've had this in our lives now for the year, and hopefully everybody's standing up somewhat, in it. But what do you think about that skill area? Because that's not going away, is it? Once we get back into the classroom on a regular basis, do you see that is going to be another quiver of arrows for teachers to use in their classrooms?
I think
Heck, yeah, yeah, Sue, yeah.
it, as teachers have done it more, they've gotten more comfortable and in many cases a lot more skillful at that kind of content delivery via electronics. Um, is not something that most teachers learned in school, so they had to kind of learn it on the fly.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the the one of the pieces that I read within the guidelines for the ARP and for the ESSER, the other resource that's going to fund the schools, is that the state who receives the funding must subgrant all of this funding, not less than 90% of it to the local public schools. So I was going to ask if Sue, if you knew anything about how that worked in Hawaii and other programs, which I didn't. It's just kind of a surprise question. I know subgranting is often the case. But that's 90% of it has to go out that way. And it just seems that's a little bit of a new twist.
I think that's where the challenge is going to be. Um, it comes to the state, and then will, in theory, go to the districts. And then how do the districts get it out to the principals and into the classroom? It sounds like it needs to happen very quickly. And what does that look like? It sounded like it was still a little bit unclear.
Yeah, it really doesn't, especially for our unique setup in Hawaii as the single school district. But it doesn't really work as a single school district. And are the districts actually going to have a major role? So all of that's going to have to be fleshed out. Now, as they're fleshing out the process for delivery, then what about the priorities for which the money will go? Do you think state and local schools will agree on how and what priorities this funding should be put to? Hector, do you have a comment on that?
Well, that's a very good question. I think one of the challenges is exactly that. How are they going to prioritize things? And unfortunately, in the past, the evidence shows the priorities have been more in on areas that, let's say, school principals or even administrators or even the teachers think that are the right way to invest the money and to do the things that they need to do in the classroom. However, those things sometimes are kind of ethnocentric in themselves, and they don't account for the culture and the language of the students nor of the community. So in Native American communities, that has been the case. So like they said, the road to the road to you know in many cases the road can be paved with good intentions, but it's not necessarily a good one. So I think that that's something that we have to be careful with, because we can all have good intentions, but I think that one promising aspect is that they are also requiring for folks to be thinking about research evidence and research-based practices. And that's important because I think that hopefully that will help us to kind of stay centered on the idea on what the needs are and what the needs are within those communities that are really struggling, and so because there are some schools that are struggling more than others. And I don't know if that's the case in Hawaii, but I will tell you that that's the case here in Texas. So in their school districts that have a higher number of students who are low socioeconomic status than other districts. So all those things need to be taken into account. So and the issue is also, do we have in mind a set of guidelines, and not only guidelines, but also a group that will be the group that keep us accountable about the educational practices, so in other words, a group that will keep the accountable, even the policymakers, so then we can all be rooting for the educator, meaning that sometimes policy and education don't go hand in hand, even though they should. And so that's the challenge. And I think that that's where we need to probably have, community engagement in some ways.
Well, I think that those points are really important. And I know on table 5, I have, if we could put that up, the number of schools and percentage by Title I status in the state. It shows how high poverty exists here in our schools. Most of these schools, look at a high percent of them are Title I schools. So that means that the students are eligible for free lunch and they meet other criteria for having a school be a Title I school. So that not only we talk about our diversity and our cultural accomplishments and affiliations that work, and we often focus on that and forget that we have a high poverty. We have very needy students here in this state, even though it's paradise and there's a wonderful beach out there. But we have to be informed of that, which also goes back then to the teachers and what to do with them, Sue, because they are going to be given access, maybe, or maybe that the opportunity here may be to make a difference for the skill sets of these teachers, as we already talked about before with the technology, but also then, as Hector brings up, the research findings and the knowledge base that we now have very much out of the work that's been done in Hawaii, and we've talked about on previous of these shows. And so, how are they going to be given access to that so that they can understand the students have many variables that they need to and needs that just need to be addressed? What do you think that priority will be for the state here? Will we see some attention to that, do you think?
Well, two thoughts. One is we're going to have an avalanche of money. I'm wondering what the accountability for that will be. What's going to be the measure of success?
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, what's the measure of it? Yes, absolutely. Well, to dig into the paperwork, but one of the measures we all know is student achievement in Hawaii. And so, if we have a chart of that showing the performance of Hawaiian fourth grade students or students in Hawaii, um, their performance on the 2015 fourth grade NAEP or National Assessment of Educational Progress, the literacy or reading assessment. This is generally considered the nation's report card. And we can look to that chart to see that in comparison of Hawaii to the US levels, that there may be some work to do here. And we see that, below basic performance or proficiency on that test at the US average level is 32%, whereas Hawaii's almost 40%. That's below basic. And then with you, as you go up to the next level, the number is close, but but they accumulate, the Hawaii's accumulated number is concerning, because that leaves us with quite a few youngsters who are in need of additional help in their literacy skills as this test literacy. Fortunately, there's unfortunately, there's a little bit of a difference too here with the at or above proficient on the tests. That level is different. I can't tell you if it's significantly different. I don't know, Hector, maybe you know, but I think that probably it might be. But for those students who are above proficient, and which which means they may have success, with their college work and also their careers, is 35 for the U.S. and then 29% for the Hawaiian students. So that whatever other measures there are, and there are many, but this one is Hawaii's focus on this would, I think, serve well. Do you agree? What do other states do? Hector, have you had experience with measures of accountability in Texas?
Well, it seems that that's a good beginning, right? To begin the process of understanding how they are succeeding academically. But I think that one of the challenges has been to, sometimes we only link success to the academic component, meaning to what the learning that goes on in the school, and we forget about the socio-emotional development of the students, as well as these days the mental health issues that are arising out of the challenges that every family had to face by being confined at home and not socializing with others as we used to. So I think that we need to have a matrix that actually accounts for all those aspects, because otherwise we will continue to make the same mistake, thinking that a single number can actually tell you something about a student or about yourself or about myself, when in reality we are more complex than that. So I think that that's going to be the challenge for any state, to begin the process of thinking outside the box and to realizing that no child lives in a vacuum, but we are all actually developing, through interactions and through social modes. So, going back to what you were asking earlier, and Sue was also responding to that, the need that there is even for technology to be interactive, right? And then professional development for teachers. That's what it means. It means for us to look for ways in which teachers can have professional development that is going to help them to really think about, how do I create activities that bring my students higher order thinking into play, right? Even through the internet. And
Yes,
why? Because we want to be prepared and we want to be able to work with our students at different levels.
yes, yes. Do you have a comment responding to that?
I do. I agree with Hector. A single score doesn't tell you as much as you would hope. Um, Human beings are complex, and they come in as a total package. I am worried about classroom teachers this year because they're going to be faced with a basket full of problems that they haven't really had to deal with before. Um, so I'm wondering whether some of this money might not go to coaching and support of the classroom teacher, both for the academic element, but also for the social emotional and the family relationships. You know,
There you go.
how do you work with all of the family? Because all of those elements impact, the child's academic performance.
That's very interesting. And doesn't that get us at that word that is being used now called transactional? So, the intersection of all of these things is undeniable and needs to be. We need to be aware of that. Well, let's just go from one of you to the other on a recommendation that you would have for the state. You've been moving towards in your last statements what I think your recommendations would be, what you see as very important to recommend to the state of Hawaii to think about in managing to deploy this money for the best interest of young learning. What would you say? In the next minute, we'll finish up. Hector, how about you?
Sure. I would say that a key component has to be capacity building for parents. Unless we help the parents to see how they can use those resources, then resources are tools, and tools you need to learn how to use them at home, in the classroom, and in the community. And so I think that when we look at resources in that way, then we can actually see that it behooves us to actually get the parents prepared so they can also be participants in the process.
Really important leader for all of the work of education. Okay, Sue, your recommendation.
Well, I think I've alluded to it before. Having a clear definition for teachers as to where they should focus their energy this year, uh, getting kids back engaged in the learning process and being excited about learning, and how administrators can support that process so that they're not kind of out there on their own in their classrooms by themselves trying to figure out what to do.
Isolation, exactly. Well, I think we're getting to aloha time, and we'll have to wrap it up. So I think that you've made some insightful comments and excellent recommendations. I mean, throughout the comments on this show. I think you've given us the best of your broad knowledge and deep considerations of how to impact teaching and learning when you finally do get the resources to try and do it. So I'm Stephanie Dalton. This is the state of Hawaii on ThinkTech Live streaming network. We've been talking remotely with Associate Professor Hector Rivera and teacher, coach, and author Soups Entz about federal ARP, the American Republic, the Recovery Plan, and ESSER funding, which is coming very soon to Hawaii's Department of Education and to the public schools. My guest recommendations for deploying the record level of funding are extremely informative for ensuring Hawaii and its students prosper, and especially those historically less successful in school. I'll see you again in 2 weeks on the next date of the state of Hawaii. And mahalo for your attention, everyone. And thank you to our guests, too. Aloha.